Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. So this happened about 3 months ago, and I'm still kind of amazed at how perfectly everything worked out. I live in this really nice high-rise building downtown in a major city. The building is fairly new, maybe 5 years old, and it's one of those places where everything is premium. The rent isn't cheap, but I do well for myself as a software architect at a tech company, so I can afford the nicer things in life. When I bought my unit 2 years ago, I also purchased the parking space that goes with it, and I don't mean just any parking space. This particular spot cost me an additional $50,000 on top of my unit price, but it was worth every penny. It's right next to the elevator on the underground level. It's wider than the standard spots, and it's got this perfect setup where I can get in and out without worrying about door dings from other cars. The space is legally deeded to my unit, meaning I own it just like I own my apartment. It's not some rental situation or building policy thing. I have the actual deed paperwork and everything. I drive a pretty distinctive car too. It's a metallic blue Tesla Model S that I keep in pristine condition. I'm kind of particular about my car, probably more than most people, but I work hard for my money and I like nice things. The car stands out in our parking garage because most people drive standard sedans or smaller cars. Mine is definitely recognizable. Now, there's this woman who lives in the building. I'll call her my neighbor for the sake of this story. She lives a few floors below me in what I'm pretty sure is one of the smaller units. I don't know her well, but I've seen her around the building enough to know she's got this attitude about her. She drives this huge black SUV that looks like it hasn't been washed in months. The thing is massive, and she's terrible at parking it. I've seen her take up parts of 2 spaces before, or park so close to other cars that people probably can't get their doors open. The thing about this woman is that she's got this entitled attitude that just rubs me the wrong way. She acts like the building rules don't really apply to her. I've seen her prop open the building's security door for delivery people instead of making them buzz up like they're supposed to. She leaves packages in the lobby instead of taking them to her unit. Little stuff like that, but it adds up to show you what kind of person she is. A few weeks before this all went down, I actually caught her trying to park in my spot one evening when I came home from work. She was sitting in her SUV with the engine running, trying to figure out how to squeeze that massive thing into my space. When she saw me waiting in my car behind her, she just waved and drove off to find another spot. I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured she just made a mistake or wasn't paying attention to the space numbers. But then I had to go out of town for work. My company was sending me to a conference and some client meetings on the West Coast, and it was going to be a full week away. I left on a Monday morning and my flight wasn't until noon, so I left my building around 9 in the morning to head to the airport. As I was pulling out of my parking spot, I noticed the same neighbor walking around the parking garage, kind of looking around at different spaces. I thought it was weird timing, but I was focused on getting to the airport and didn't really think much about it. The week away was pretty standard for these work trips. Long days in conference rooms, client dinners, hotel rooms that all look the same. By Friday afternoon, I was definitely ready to get home. My flight back was delayed, so I didn't get home until almost midnight on Sunday. I was exhausted, dragging my suitcase and laptop bag, just looking forward to getting to my apartment and sleeping in my own bed. I took the elevator down to the parking garage to get my car so I could move it from the airport parking structure where I'd left it. But when the elevator doors opened and I walked toward my space, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My parking space, my $50,000 deeded parking space, had this massive black SUV sitting in it, the same SUV that belonged to my neighbor, and it wasn't like she had just quickly ducked in there for a few minutes. This car was positioned perfectly in the center of the space, like she'd taken her time to park it properly. There was even some kind of handwritten note on her dashboard that said reserved in what looked like marker on a piece of cardboard. I stood there for probably a full minute just staring at this situation. Here I am, exhausted from a week of travel, and this woman had just decided that my parking space was hers now. Not only that, but she'd made herself a little sign like that somehow made it official. My first instinct was to call the building's towing company right away. We have a contract with a local towing service, and they're pretty good about responding quickly for parking violations. But as I stood there looking at this SUV in my spot, I realized that just getting it towed wasn't really going to teach her the lesson she needed to learn. She'd used my space for an entire week while I was gone. A simple tow would cost her maybe $300 and some inconvenience, but that didn't seem like enough for someone who thought they could just claim someone else's property. I decided I needed to be smarter about this. Instead of calling the towing company right away, I took out my phone and started taking pictures. I photographed the SUV from multiple angles, making sure you could clearly see it was in my numbered space. I took pictures of the space number painted on the wall, and I took pictures of my own parking permit that I keep displayed in my car window. I also took a picture of her ridiculous reserved sign on the dashboard. Then I went back upstairs and called the building management company. Even though it was midnight on a Sunday, they have an emergency line that's answered 24 hours. I explained the situation to the person on duty and asked them to document the violation officially. I wanted a paper trail showing exactly when I discovered the violation and reported it. The person I spoke with took down all the details and said they'd have the building manager contact me first thing Monday morning. They also said they'd send someone down to the garage to take their own photos for their records. I asked them specifically to note in their documentation that this was a deeded parking space, not just a building policy violation, which meant it was actually a property trespass issue. Since I couldn't park in my own space, I had to find somewhere else to put my car. Luckily, there are a few visitor spaces in our garage, and one of them was empty, so I parked there for the night. But visitor spaces are only supposed to be used for short periods, so I knew I couldn't leave my car there for long. Monday morning, the building manager called me around 8 a.m. She was actually pretty upset about the situation when I explained what had happened. She told me that parking violations are taken seriously in our building, especially when it involves deeded spaces, because those are legally owned property, not just building policy issues. She explained that they had indeed documented the violation and that there's actually a progressive fine structure for parking violations. The first day is $50, the second day is $100, the third day is $200, and it keeps doubling each day after that. Plus, after 3 days, they're authorized to have the vehicle towed at the owner's expense. But here's the thing that made this even better. Since I had been away for a week and hadn't been able to report the violation immediately, and since my neighbor clearly knew I was away, the building manager said they could backdate the violation to the day after I left for my trip. The security cameras in the garage would show when her car first appeared in my space. I asked her to check the camera footage, and sure enough, my neighbor had moved her SUV into my space on Tuesday morning, just 1 day after I left for my trip. That meant by the time I got back on Sunday night, her car had been illegally parked in my deeded space for 6 full days. The math on the fines was pretty incredible. Day 1 was $50, day 2 was $100, day 3 was $200, day 4 was $400, day 5 was $800, and day 6 was $1,600. The total fine would be $3,150, plus the towing and storage fees, which would be another several $100s. But I still wanted to give her a chance to move her car before I had it towed. Not because I felt bad for her, but because I wanted to see what kind of explanation she'd come up with when confronted about it. Monday evening around 6 p.m., I was coming home from work and I saw her in the lobby checking her mail. I walked over and said hello, keeping my voice completely calm and friendly. She looked up and gave me this big smile like nothing was wrong. She said something like, "Oh, hey there, you're back from your trip. How was it?" I told her it was fine, and then mentioned that I'd noticed her car was in my parking space. I said it in the most casual way possible, like I was just making conversation about the weather. Her response was absolutely perfect for what I had planned. She got this little smirk on her face and said that she'd needed the space while I was away because she was having some work done in her unit and needed easier access for the contractors. She said since I wasn't using it anyway, she figured it wasn't a big deal. Then she said the line that really sealed her fate. She told me that possession is 9/10 of the law, and since she'd been using the space all week, she had just as much right to it as anyone else. She said it with this attitude, like she was being clever and I should just accept that she'd outsmarted me somehow. I just smiled and told her that it was an interesting perspective and that I was sure everything would work out fine. I said I hoped she was enjoying the space and wished her a good evening. Then I went upstairs to my apartment. She probably thought she'd won something in that conversation. She had this look on her face like she was proud of herself for standing up to me. But what she didn't realize is that she'd just admitted to knowingly and intentionally trespassing on my property, and I had witnesses in the lobby who heard the whole thing. That night, I called the building manager and told her about the conversation. I explained that my neighbor had essentially confessed to intentionally using my space without permission, knowing full well that it wasn't hers to use. The building manager said that changed things significantly because now it wasn't just a parking violation, but intentional trespass on deeded property. Tuesday morning, I called the building's legal counsel. Our building management company has a lawyer on retainer for dealing with stuff like this, and I wanted to make sure we did everything by the book. The lawyer confirmed that since this was a deeded space, it was a matter of property law, not just building policy. He said the fines and towing were completely appropriate and he'd be happy to represent the building's interests if my neighbor wanted to challenge anything. I also asked the building manager to send my neighbor an official notice about the violation and the accumulated fines. I wanted her to have a chance to move her car and pay the fines before we moved to the towing step. It's not that I was feeling generous, but I wanted to make sure we followed all the proper procedures so she couldn't claim later that she wasn't given proper notice. Tuesday afternoon, the building manager called me to let me know that she'd delivered the notice to my neighbor's unit. The notice explained that her vehicle was illegally parked in a deeded space, that fines had been accumulating since the day after I left for my trip, and that if the vehicle wasn't moved and the fines weren't paid within 24 hours, the vehicle would be towed and additional storage fees would apply. Wednesday evening, I went down to check if she'd moved her car. Nope. Still sitting right there in my space with that stupid reserved sign still on the dashboard. The building manager told me that my neighbor had actually come to the office that afternoon to complain about the notice. She'd argued that she shouldn't have to pay any fines because she was only using a space that was sitting empty anyway. The building manager had explained to her that it didn't matter if the space was being used or not because it was privately owned property, just like if she'd decided to move into my apartment while I was away. My neighbor had apparently gotten pretty upset and demanded to speak to someone higher up. The building manager had offered to have her speak with the legal counsel, but my neighbor had stormed out instead. Thursday morning, I decided it was time to move forward with the towing. I called the contracted towing company and explained the situation. They said they'd need to see the official violation notice and my proof of ownership for the space. I met them in the parking garage around 10 a.m. with all my paperwork. The towing operator looked everything over and confirmed that it was a legitimate tow. He said they see this kind of thing fairly regularly in buildings with deeded spaces because people don't understand the difference between building policy violations and actual property law violations. The whole towing process took maybe 20 minutes. They hooked up the SUV and drove away with it. I moved my car from the visitor space back into my own spot where it belonged. I have to admit, it felt pretty satisfying to see my car back in its proper place after almost a week and a half of dealing with this situation. My space looked so much better with a clean, well-maintained car in it instead of that dirty SUV. Around noon, I got a call from the building manager. Apparently, my neighbor had come down to leave for lunch and discovered her car was gone. She'd immediately called the building's security desk in a panic, claiming her car had been stolen. The security guard had directed her to the building management office. The building manager said my neighbor had been absolutely furious when she found out her car had been legally towed. She demanded to know who had authorized it and threatened to call the police. The building manager had calmly explained that the towing was authorized by the building's legal counsel and that all proper procedures had been followed. Then came the best part. The building manager handed her the final bill for everything. 6 days of accumulated parking violation fines totaling $3,150. Towing fee of $375. Storage fees at the towing company lot of $40 per day until she picked up her vehicle, plus a $50 administrative fee for processing the violation. The total bill was over $4,000. My neighbor had apparently stared at the bill for a long time before asking if there was some kind of mistake. The building manager had explained very carefully how each fine was calculated, and showed her the security camera footage that proved exactly when her car had first appeared in my space. My neighbor had tried to argue that the fines were excessive and that she shouldn't have to pay for days when I wasn't even in town to use the space. The building manager had explained that it didn't matter whether I was physically present or not because I owned the space just like I owned my apartment unit. She'd pointed out that my neighbor wouldn't expect to be able to stay in my apartment for free just because I was out of town. My neighbor had then tried to argue that she didn't understand it was a deeded space and thought it was just regular building parking. But the building manager had pointed out that every deeded space in our garage has a special sign indicating it's private property, and my space clearly displays my unit number and a notice that unauthorized vehicles will be towed. Finally, my neighbor had asked if there was any way to reduce the fines or work out a payment plan. The building manager had told her that the fines were set by building policy and approved by the legal counsel, so there wasn't any flexibility on the amount. As for a payment plan, she'd need to discuss that with the accounting department, but the car would stay in the towing company lot, accumulating storage fees until the bill was paid in full. The building manager said my neighbor had left the office pretty upset, muttering something about getting her own lawyer. But a few hours later, she'd called back to ask for the contact information for the towing company so she could arrange to get her car back. Friday afternoon, I saw her in the elevator and she wouldn't even look at me. She just stared at the floor numbers the whole ride. I didn't say anything to her, but I have to admit I was curious about whether she'd actually paid all those fines. The following Monday, the building manager called to let me know that my neighbor had indeed paid the full amount. Apparently, she'd tried one more time to negotiate the fines down, but the accounting department had explained that the amounts were non-negotiable because they were set by building policy and legal requirements. The building manager also told me that they were implementing some new procedures as a result of this incident. They were going to be more proactive about monitoring the garage for parking violations, and they were going to send out a building-wide notice reminding residents about the parking policies and the difference between standard assigned spaces and deeded private spaces. A few days later, I did see that building-wide notice posted in the lobby and sent out via email. It didn't mention my neighbor specifically, but it was pretty clear what had prompted the reminder. The notice explained that parking violations would be enforced strictly, and that deeded spaces were private property where unauthorized parking would be treated as trespassing. The best part of the whole situation, though, was the change in my neighbor's behavior. Before this happened, she had this arrogant attitude like the building rules didn't really apply to her. She'd act like she was doing everyone a favor just by following basic building policies. Now she's completely different. When I see her in the lobby or elevator, she's polite but keeps her distance. She doesn't have that smug attitude anymore, and I've noticed that she's much more careful about following building rules. She doesn't prop doors open for delivery people anymore, and she actually takes her packages up to her unit instead of leaving them in the lobby. I think the $4,000 lesson really drove home the point that actions have consequences and that other people's property isn't just there for her convenience. As for my parking space, it's been blissfully peaceful ever since. I park there every day without having to worry about finding someone else's car in my spot. The space stays clean and well-maintained, and I never have to hunt around the garage for an alternative place to park. The whole experience taught me something important about dealing with entitled people. Sometimes the best response isn't an immediate confrontation or argument. Sometimes it's better to stay calm, follow proper procedures, and let the system work the way it's designed to work. The legal and procedural framework was already in place to handle this exact situation. I just had to be patient enough to let it play out properly. I also learned that people like my neighbor often count on others being too conflict-averse or too busy to fully enforce rules and consequences. She probably thought that even if I complained about her using my space, I'd eventually just give up and let her get away with it. She definitely didn't expect me to follow through with the full legal process and maximum penalties, but the thing is, when someone shows you that level of disrespect for your property and your rights, you can't just let it slide. If I'd just asked her nicely to move her car and left it at that, she would have learned that she could get away with it. She probably would have done it again the next time I went out of town or tried some other entitled behavior with other residents in the building. By following through with the proper procedures and making sure she faced the full consequences of her actions, I sent a clear message that this kind of behavior isn't acceptable and won't be tolerated. Not just to her, but to anyone else in the building who might have been thinking about testing the boundaries of what they can get away with. The building management was really professional about the whole thing, too. They took the situation seriously from the beginning and made sure everything was handled by the book. Having that kind of support from building management makes a huge difference when you're dealing with problem residents. I think the key was treating this as a legal and procedural matter rather than a personal conflict. By focusing on the objective facts, the written policies, and the proper legal procedures, there wasn't room for argument or negotiation. My neighbor couldn't claim that I was being unreasonable or vindictive because I was just following the established rules and procedures that apply to everyone in the building. The financial consequence was significant enough to make sure she really understood the seriousness of what she'd done. $4,000 isn't pocket change for most people, and having to pay that much for a week of parking probably made her think twice about trying anything similar in the future. And the public nature of the consequence probably mattered too. Other residents in the building heard about what happened, and now everyone knows that parking violations and property violations are taken seriously here. The building-wide notice that went out afterward reinforced that message for anyone who might not have heard about the specific incident. I've been in the building for over 2 years now, and I plan to stay for the foreseeable future. Having a peaceful, well-managed building where people respect each other's property and follow the rules makes a big difference in quality of life. It was worth the time and effort to make sure this situation was handled properly because it helps maintain the kind of community I want to live in. My neighbor and I don't really interact much now, which is probably better for both of us. When we do cross paths, she's polite but distant, which suits me fine. I'm not looking to be friends with someone who thinks they can just take my property whenever it's convenient for them, but I don't need to be enemies either. The important thing is that she learned her lesson about respecting other people's property rights, and that lesson cost her $4,000 that she'll probably never forget. Every time she parks her car now, she's probably thinking about proper parking procedures and making sure she's in a space she's actually authorized to use. As for me, I'm enjoying having my parking space back and not having to worry about entitled neighbors thinking they can just claim my property as their own. The space is worth every penny I paid for it, and now everyone in the building understands exactly why these deeded spaces are treated as private property. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting emotional or vindictive. Sometimes it's just letting the system work exactly the way it's supposed to work, and making sure people face the full consequences of their entitled behavior. This situation worked out perfectly because I stayed calm, followed procedures, and let the legal framework do exactly what it was designed to do. And the satisfaction of seeing my clean, well-maintained car back in its proper spot after dealing with a week and a half of entitled behavior from my neighbor, that was absolutely priceless. The next one is a malicious compliance story. This happened in Den Helder approximately 20 years ago. One of my coworkers was a typical Amsterdammer in the worst sense of the word. Loud-mouthed, arrogant, really full of himself, and he thought of himself as untouchable just because he had been a Dutch Marine for over a decade. Let's call him Adam, not his real name, obviously. A little disclaimer just to make sure I don't stigmatize people from Amsterdam. I've met a lot of typical Amsterdammers who are so in the best sense of the word. Loud, but really enjoyable. Very confident, but humble and decent. Back to Adam with just a few examples. He would brag to people about cheating on his fiancée, but he would also make sure everybody knows he actually really loves her very much. When called out on his hypocrisy, he would get loud and offended, and he would tell you that you just don't understand and to shut the F up. Je snapt er niks van, je mo gewoonje rotbek houve, asterisk heavy Amsterdam accent asterisk. He would argue about new policies and critique everything, but never in a constructive way. It would always be as offensive as possible. He would argue with our chief, a sergeant, and the head of transport, an adjutant. And he would always be loud and deviant and would tell them he was stationed there longer so they should back off and respect him. This always ended undivided because nothing was actually said or done that would warrant any form of punishment or reprimand. It would annoy the hell out of the higher-ups, though. He would operate heavy equipment dangerously. Adam would drive forklifts in a dangerous way, steering too aggressively so the vehicle would behave instable. Lucky for everyone, those machines were very heavy and stable, but even so, Adam once drove on the highway with an empty coach because he had to pick up a group of people. He put the vehicle on cruise control, got out of his chair, stood next to the steering wheel holding it with one hand, and used his phone to video himself doing just that. About 20 years ago, so low-quality video with a then-modern phone, think Nokia/Sony Ericsson just for context. Then he would proudly tell everybody in the driver's pool about his shenanigans and show the video as proud evidence. Nobody ratted him out, but the higher-ups got wind of it, so they asked him about it. Of course, he denied everything, and the video was non-existent according to Adam, so he dodged consequences. He then proceeded by telling all the co-workers about his little talk and ended with something like, "What are they going to do? Fire me?" and then laugh. Later, he got even bolder, and he got into even more frequent arguments with the higher-ups, and he started to shout things like, "If you don't like it, then fire me. Als je niet bevalt, ons la medan." Then after, he would brag about it and tell everybody they obviously can't fire him, even if they wanted to. Ze kennen me toch niet ontslaan, alsof ze willen wietje. It's fair to say that the atmosphere within our unit grew tense, and it was evident that the higher-ups were very much fed up with Adam's behavior. Until one day Adam overstepped. He got into another argument and came up with his usual bickering. Of course it got loud and he came with his usual, "Then fire me" comment. But to his horror, the adjutant responded with something like, "Great, you're fired. Now walk with me to my office so we can make it official." This went like a shockwave through the driver's pool, and we could hear Adam shouting in the office, which was a little further. His screaming started with a lot of fire. The adjutant and sergeant responded in kind. Then Adam's tone changed to a more desperate tone, and after that it got kind of silent. When he left the office, his eyes were red, and he did not say a thing to anyone. In hindsight, it was obvious that the higher-ups were waiting for a moment like this to present itself. Adam took his last PTO and vacation days and was very docile for his last few weeks. Thing got a lot more pleasant after his departure. The next one is an entitled people story. So I recently spent a full week at Disneyland with my family. Everything was awesome. The cast members were amazing, although there were definitely a couple of odd Disney adults, and this is where it gets fun. First, I should say that I am sincerely the most walkover person there is. If someone has a problem with me, I usually just let it go and walk away. I never stand up for myself. It is a horrible trait for sure. Well, this time I finally did something about it. It was the last day of our trip and our first time ever going during a seasonal event for Halloween. Our last visit had been 11 years ago, so I wanted to make sure everyone had the best time. One of my mom's biggest wishes was to meet Jack Skellington and take a photo with him. We had tried so hard, but with the little ones it was nearly impossible. On Wednesday, I had my baby with me and we had just finished Pirates of the Caribbean for the third time in a row. I saw Jack walking by and checked the app. Sure enough, he was scheduled for a photo op in 20 minutes. I thought, hell yes. I called my mom, who was in Toontown with the other kids, and told her to head over. It would be a 10 to 15 minute walk to get to the area behind Pirates, so I said no biggie, I'll get in line. I got to the line and spoke with a cast member, who I will call Abby. She was super sweet, blonde, with her hair in a braid. I asked her if this was the line for Jack, and she said yes, but I would need to leave my stroller by the fence a few feet away. No problem. I grabbed my sleeping baby and got in line. I was standing behind two ladies who were chatting with each other and occasionally with Abby. Wanting to make sure I wasn't breaking any rules, I asked Abby, "Is it okay if I wait in line for my family who will be taking the photo?" She said, "Absolutely. As long as one person is holding the spot, when you approach the door, your family can all walk up." Perfect. I didn't want the line to look longer and cause the meetup to close early since there could be 9 of us taking a photo. At that point, Abby told us it would be about a 30-minute wait. I was, at the time, the last person in line. A woman, who I will call Karen, walked up and asked Abby about the line. Abby told her yes, this was Jack's line, and also told her to park her double stroller where I had parked mine. Older man stood behind me, and she got behind him. This is important. I was hyper-aware of my surroundings because I knew I would have to describe everything I saw around me for my mom to reach me. A few minutes later, the 2 ladies ahead of me left. I stepped up into their spot, now behind a family of 3, a father, mother, and daughter. I'll call them the Nosy family. My mom texted that she was close and needed help finding me. I FaceTimed her for 2 or 3 minutes, and because the line wrapped around a column, I had my back turned for a bit. When I turned back, I was behind the Nosy family again. This is where the fun begins. Karen suddenly stepped out and loudly called me out as a line jumper. "Excuse me? Were you in line? Because I don't remember seeing you behind this family." She was 2 spots behind me, and there was also an older man standing behind me. I calmly but firmly said, "I've been standing in line this whole time." She turned to the older man and said, "Was she in front of you? Was she? Because I remember you standing behind this family." He didn't want to get involved and just shrugged without sticking up for the fact that I had been in front of him. Whatever. I said again, "Like I said, I've been here the entire time. Go ask the attendant." Karen stopped for a moment, but I could tell she wasn't done. I brushed it off and laughed about it when my sister Jay came up while my mom was parked with the little ones. I told my sister I had just been accused of cutting and laughed at how ridiculous it was. But Karen decided to escalate. She brought over another cast member, who I will call Tracy. Tracy had the attitude of someone who just wanted to get this over with and not deal with adults acting up. Karen pointed at me, talking loudly, saying I jumped the line. My sister, who is confrontational and loves to argue when she knows she is right, jumped in and started going back and forth with Karen and Tracy. Tracy suggested I step out of line. Both my sister and I immediately said no. My sister added, "Fine, even if we can't join her line, she can stay in her spot." At this point, people were pointing, murmuring, and the Nosy family was speaking in Spanish saying I wasn't behind them. My mom was still confused about what was happening, so I called her again as the line moved forward. I asked my 9-year-old niece to stand with me, BC. I felt so embarrassed by all the pointing. I spoke in Spanish, knowing Karen and the Nosy family would hear, and told my mom, "Don't worry, I can see the attendant I spoke with earlier, and I'll make sure to talk to her because I know she remembers me." The Nosy family kept staring at me, making my niece even more uncomfortable. I reassured her to ignore it. Finally, the Nosy family was at the front and I was right behind them. I reached out to Abby. "Hi, sorry, I hope you remember me from earlier when I kept bugging you." She smiled. "Of course. Yes, once you're up, your family can walk up here." The Nosy mom immediately cut in. "Well, she actually skipped the line because she wasn't behind us." Karen jumped back into the conversation too. "Yes, she actually skipped the line." Abby looked at me, then at them, and said firmly, "No, I spoke with her earlier. She has been here the entire time. I remember her." My sister then told the Nosy family, "What does it matter to you anyway? You're ahead of her. This only affects people behind you, so stay out of it." They immediately went quiet. Then Tracy suddenly tried to jump back in and accuse me again. Abby doubled down. "No, I spoke with her. I walked her to the line myself. She has been here for the past 30 minutes. Karen, the Nosy family, and Tracy all went quiet after that. Abby even leaned in to talk to my baby, who had just woken up. "Oh, he's finally awake? I bet he's excited to meet Jack." I finally called my mom over and we all got our photos. It felt so good, and I made sure everyone in line could hear it. It felt amazing to stand my ground for once. I couldn't stop relishing in it. I hope that Abby knows how much I appreciated her in that moment. I wish I could remember her name. If you happen to know someone there who matches that description, tell her thank you. Anyway, thank you for watching.